It's been quite a number of years since the Leek Stereo 130 hit shelves, and while it wasn't an initial hit, it did kind of really pick up momentum and snowball once they started getting paired up with the Wharfedale Lintons. There are no shortage of vintage looking modern hi-fi components on the market, and it all kind of started right here with that Leek Stereo 130. And while I think the majority of us who heard the Dentons and the Lintons together with the Leek Stereo 130 really enjoyed that sound, we knew that both the Dentons and the Lintons weren't hitting their maximum potential with that pairing. And that was largely due to the Stereo 130's 45 watt output. So here we are, a few years later, enter the Leek Stereo 230, bringing additional power and far superior bass control. And since the launch of the Leek Stereo 230, we have also had the release of the Wharfedale Super Dentons, which are the speakers that I did most of my testing for the Leek Stereo 230 with, as they are the most appropriate speakers for my room. Rest assured though, whatever Wharfedale heritage speaker you go with, Denton, Linton, Super Denton, doesn't matter. If you get the walnut veneer, you're going to have a beautiful matchy-matchy system that's going to be quite arresting to look at for those who love that vintage hi-fi aesthetic. And speaking of that walnut casing, this is a real walnut veneer. And in person, it looks and feels fantastic. This is not at all a glossy finish. It is more in line with, I guess, like a modern matte finish, or for those of you who are old enough to remember, a wax finish from back in the day. Now this integrated amplifier comes with an ESS 938 DAC chip, which in its own right is a fantastically detailed DAC chip, but as we know, it's all about how it's integrated into the circuitry. And I can say with certainty that this is a fantastic implementation, at least based on the way it sounds. Of course, it has all your traditional digital inputs. It has your optical, it has your coax. What is kind of unusual for an aesthetic piece of hi-fi like this, but something that I'm very happy is there, is the inclusion of a HDMI ARC input. Yeah, it's one of those things that kind of feels wrong given the visual of the system. You don't look at something really old and go, I'm going to plug my TV into that. For those of us who are in living rooms where the home integrated amplifier has to pull double duties, it is a fantastic inclusion, and I know that is a lot of us, myself included. It also includes the usual suspects. You've got a moving magnet phono stage, you've got a Bluetooth connection, and you have a 12 volt trigger. So if you have the matching Leek CDT or CD transport, you can set those up so when one switches on, they both switch on, which is always convenient. But we need to go back to what I was talking about earlier, the real jump over the Stereo 130, and that is, of course, the power. We are talking 75 watts at 8 ohms and 115 watts at 4 ohms. That is a huge leap from the 130's 45 watts at 8 ohms and 65 watts at 4 ohms. And I do think, in particular with the Lintons, a critique we often heard about that pairing was as good as they sound together. Depending on what you were listening to, it was possible for the Lintons to sometimes sound a little skeletal. That is no longer a problem. This isn't just a difference you can hear, this is a difference you can feel in the system. It is significantly heavier and significantly bigger than the previous Leek Stereo 130. It has had a massive upgrade to those toroidal transformers, and what the result of that is an amplifier that is substantially deeper than the Stereo 130, and this is very easily shown by sitting it next to the matching Leek CDT, because the CDT and the 130 were made basically to have the same size chassis. So you can see here just how big of a difference there is now between the Stereo 230 and the Leek CDT or Stereo 130. So those toroidal transformers that have been upgraded, when that comes to the sonics that implements, well, and this is really well showed off by the Wharfedale Super Dentons, it leads to a much tighter grip on the bass. There is much more authority and control there than there was with the Leek Stereo 130, or indeed with the Audiolab 6000A Play, which I also tested with the Wharfedale Super Dentons. So we have a bigger sound with far more control across the board. This is something that's highlighted incredibly well by Viagra Boys' Cave World LP. This also leads to one of the other big advantages over the previous pairings with the Leek Stereo 130. Something that we mentioned in our video of the 130 paired up with the Lintons back in the day was that you kind of really needed to turn the Leek up to about 12 o'clock or halfway for the speakers to really come alive. And that is simply not the case with the Stereo 230. Even at low volumes, things sound incredibly lively and controlled. And something else that's worth mentioning about the Leek Stereo 230 sound is, despite its vintage aesthetic, it has quite a modern sound, which isn't the case for the, say, Wharfedale, Lintons, and Dentons. So these are all owned by the one group, the IAG group, but they've smartly made the decision to keep the electronics sounding modern and to allow users to color the sound with the speakers. So you're never doubling up with a very warm amplifier on warm speakers, making for a woolly sound. It's very much a very modern and detailed sound coming out of the Leek Stereo 230, which you can then color with the Wharfedale Lintons or the Wharfedale Dentons to kind of get that more vintage sound that way. But what do I mean by modern sound? Well, I would put this amplifier firmly in the neutral sound category, although I do think it has a little bit more sparkle and detail in the top end than necessarily some other amplifiers from the IAG group, such as the Audiolab 6000 and 7000 series. And that air and sparkle is really highlighted in albums such as Big Thief's, Dragon, New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You, where the acoustic cuts sound incredibly spacious and light. Meanwhile, the Leek Stereo 230's attention to detail can be easily appreciated by listening to the soundtrack to Morning of the Earth. And I find this to be an interesting example because the recordings on this album, for the most part, can probably most generously be described as average. But at the same time, the Leek Stereo 230's presentation of this album gives it basically a kind of like a smoothness over the top without hiding those details and imperfections. It just stops those imperfections from becoming distractions. And I think that's a very, very key and important distinction, especially if you like listening to older recordings which weren't necessarily done with the, let's just say, best tools available at the time. Now, that's not to say that this is a cold or sterile sounding amplifier. It's absolutely not. But I do think it pairs much more friendly with speakers such as Wharfedale's Heritage line than it does with other speaker brands like, say, maybe the KEF LS50 Meta, for example, at least to my ears. Its mid-range chops, both in terms of feel and detail, are worth highlighting. This is really evident in the 2022 Beatles Revolver reissue, especially in tracks such as Eleanor Rigby, where the strings really, really sound rich and lush. And on the other hand, you have albums such as James Guthrie's 2018 rework of Pink Floyd's Animals, which really do a fantastic job highlighting how well this amplifier handles things such as imaging, soundstage depth, and things like that. It really is a fantastic presenting album on this particular amplifier. That's not to say that it's razor sharp or Etch-a-Sketch clean, but it is an amplifier where as soon as you close your eyes, everything solidifies in front of you. There's not a massive degree of vagueness to it or anything like that. And that leads me to believe if you're someone who loves that vintage aesthetic but prefers a bit more of a modern sound, well, the Leek Stereo 230 might be for you. If you're someone who likes your physical media, and if you like vintage looking hi-fi, you probably do. There are plenty of turntables out there by the like of Projects which have a very similar walnut finish which would pair beautifully with the Leek Stereo 230. And if you collect CDs, there's also obviously the Leek CDT, something which will match with it pretty much perfectly. And as I've already said, if you match it up with Wharfedale's Heritage line, well, I think that combination visually speaks for itself. My only gripe, there's currently no Leek streamer that matches the aesthetic. Hopefully that's something that comes down the road in the future to really complete the package. you are someone who is looking for a integrated amplifier with that vintage aesthetic, but those modern conveniences, well, you definitely should have the Leek Stereo 230 on your shortlist.